It was a sunny day when a group of tourists arrived at one of the most famous landmarks in the city. They were full of excitement and energy, ready to explore, snap photos, and enjoy their trip. The place they had come to visit was known not only for its stunning beauty, but also for its rich history, and its royal guards, dressed in their impressive uniforms, were an iconic part of the experience. The tourists, however, were not all that interested in the tradition behind the guards or the significance of the place. They were just excited to take some pictures, make a scene, and show off to their friends back home. As they approached the palace, the grandeur of the architecture left them in awe, but their attention quickly turned to the royal guards standing silently at attention. The guards, stiff and unwavering, had a reputation for being disciplined and stern. Their role was to protect the royal property and the royal family, and they took their job seriously. But the tourists didn't seem to care about that. They were in vacation mode, and this was just another photo opportunity for them. They started gathering around the guards, trying to take pictures as close as possible. Some even tried to pose with the guards in the background, ignoring the rules about not getting too close. One of the tourists, a young man with a loud laugh and even louder attitude, thought it would be funny to try and make the guards laugh. He moved toward one of them, giving a dramatic bow, as if he were some kind of comedian on a stage. "What's the matter? You don't smile," he joked, expecting everyone to laugh at his cleverness. But the guard remained perfectly still, his eyes straight ahead, showing no emotion at all. The group of tourists laughed, but not for the reason the young man expected. They found it amusing how seriously the guard took his job. Another tourist, a woman in a brightly colored dress, decided to get even closer to take a picture with her phone. She moved right up to the guard, practically touching his uniform, to snap the perfect shot. She didn't seem to care about the guard's stern expression or the fact that there were clear signs posted telling visitors to keep their distance. Others in the group were also feeling confident and began taking selfies, mocking the guards in their own ways. They joked about the traditional costumes the guards wore, calling them outdated and silly. None of them were thinking about the history or the respect these guards deserved. They just wanted to have fun and prove they could get away with anything while on vacation. The more the guards stood silently, the more the tourists grew bolder. Unaware of the tension building up, the group continued to laugh and joke, taking their photos as if nothing was wrong. They were in their own little world, far from the seriousness of the situation around them. But little did they know, the royal guards weren't just there for show. They were trained for situations like this, and they wouldn't stand by and let disrespect slide. As the tourists continued their antics, the atmosphere around them began to change. A few of the more aware onlookers started to notice what was happening, sensing that something wasn't right. Still, the tourists, too caught up in their own enjoyment, paid no attention. The scene was about to take a sharp turn, but at this moment, everything still seemed like just another day of sightseeing for the group. As the tourists continued their laughter and jokes, one of the royal guards began to take notice of their disrespectful behavior. He had seen tourists behave like this before, but that didn't make it any easier. His job was to maintain order and protect the honor of the place he served, and he took it seriously. The group had crossed a line by ignoring the rules and getting too close to him. With a calm and steady gaze, the guard approached them. He stood tall, never breaking his stern expression, but his eyes were focused and alert. The tourists, still oblivious to the tension they had created, continued their antics. One of them, a young man with a wide grin on his face, was making funny faces and gesturing for the guard to smile. He thought it was all in good fun, but the guard wasn't amused. The man tried to take a photo with the guard in the background, getting even closer, but the guard's voice cut through the air, firm and unyielding. "Please, step back. It's important to respect the boundaries and traditions here," he said. His tone was calm but carried an undeniable authority. The young man stopped mid-laugh and looked at the guard, confused at first, as though he couldn't believe he was being spoken to like this. He was used to joking around and being the center of attention. He hadn't expected the guard to react so seriously. But instead of backing off, he shrugged it off and laughed again, louder this time. "Oh, come on. It's just a photo. What's the harm in that?" The rest of the group chuckled, agreeing with him, and began to mockingly repeat what the guard had said in exaggerated voices. "Respect the boundaries. Respect the traditions." They mocked, as if the guard's words were just some silly joke. They had no idea they were pushing the limits. The guard, however, remained composed. He didn't react to their mocking or the raised voices. His training had prepared him for moments like this. He didn't need to raise his voice or lose his composure. He simply stepped back slightly, signaling to another guard nearby to keep an eye on the situation. The other tourists, still caught up in their own fun, were oblivious to the increasing seriousness of the situation. A couple of them, unaware of the guard's command, decided to ignore the request entirely. One woman, holding a large camera, moved even closer, attempting to snap a close-up shot of the guard. She didn't see the danger in her actions, thinking it was just part of the fun, but the guard was no longer willing to let the situation slide. His next words were even more direct and commanding. "Step away now. This is not a joke." The authority in his voice was clear and unmistakable. The crowd around him fell silent for a moment. Some of the tourists looked around, beginning to realize the situation was getting more serious than they had imagined. The young man who had started all the trouble gave an awkward chuckle, but his smile began to fade. His bravado was starting to crack. It was becoming clear that the guard wasn't going to let things continue without consequences. Despite the pressure, the tourists still didn't fully grasp the weight of their actions. They thought they could continue pushing boundaries and testing the guard's patience, not realizing how wrong they were. For a brief moment, the group stood in uneasy silence, unsure of what to do next. The guard's unwavering stance and calm demeanor were starting to have an effect. The laughter had quieted down, but the tourists still didn't seem fully aware of what was coming next. The silence that had fallen over the group of tourists was brief but uncomfortable. The tension in the air was palpable now. The tourists were no longer laughing or making jokes. Some of them exchanged nervous glances, but a few of the more confident ones still didn't seem to fully understand the gravity of the situation. They had been taking things lightly, and now they were starting to realize that maybe they had pushed things too far. The young man who had been the most vocal about mocking the guard began to feel uneasy. He had thought it would be funny to challenge the guard, but now the guard's unyielding stance was making him rethink his approach. He wasn't used to being ignored like this, especially when he was trying to be the center of attention. His friends, still caught in the moment, continued to snap pictures, but now they were a little quieter, their smiles not quite as wide as before. They were starting to feel the weight of the situation, but the young man wasn't ready to back down just yet. "I mean, it's just a joke, right?" he said, trying to keep his voice light and casual. "What's the big deal? It's just a picture. We're not doing anything wrong." He said this, but there was a slight edge to his voice now, a hint of doubt creeping in. His bravado was starting to fade as he realized the situation wasn't as harmless as he had thought. The guard, however, didn't flinch. He remained standing tall, his eyes fixed on the group with a quiet authority that seemed to make the young man's words fall flat. The rest of the group watched closely, some of them looking at their feet, others checking their phones nervously. One tourist, a woman who had been standing off to the side, seemed to sense the growing discomfort and decided to speak up. "Maybe we should just move back a little," she said quietly, not wanting to cause any more trouble. But the young man, still unwilling to let go of his pride, waved her off. "No, it's fine," he insisted. "They can't really do anything to us, can they? They're just guards, right?" His voice carried a note of defiance, but it was clear that he wasn't quite as confident as he had been a few moments earlier. He took a step forward again, as though daring the guard to stop him. The other tourists hesitated, unsure whether to follow his lead or back off. But no one spoke up. The group had become divided, with some beginning to feel uncomfortable and others still hoping to push things a little further. The guard's response was immediate. Without raising his voice or making a single sudden move, he took a step closer to the young man. His presence alone seemed to force the young man to pause, and for the first time, the young man looked up at him with something that could be described as respect, maybe even a little fear. "Please move back," the guard said again, his tone unwavering and steady. This time, it wasn't a request. It was a command. The young man stopped. He took a slow step backward, the defiance in his posture beginning to fade. His smile had vanished completely, replaced by a look of realization. The guard stood perfectly still, never flinching, his eyes never leaving the group. His strength came from his calm, unwavering authority, and it was starting to make the tourists realize just how out of line they had been. No one said a word for a few moments. The only sound was the faint whisper of the wind against the palace walls and the soft rustling of the crowd, who were now quietly moving away from the guards. At that moment, the group began to understand that they weren't dealing with just any regular person. These guards weren't to be mocked, and their respect for tradition and authority was something that couldn't be ignored. The atmosphere, once lighthearted and filled with jokes, had shifted completely. It was no longer just about taking photos or making fun of the guards. The seriousness of the moment was beginning to settle in, and it was clear that they had made a mistake. The group of tourists stood in silence for a moment, unsure of what to do next. The once confident young man, who had been the loudest and most defiant of them all, was now stepping back, his earlier bravado fading. The royal guards, however, were not moving. They stood their ground, unwavering in their mission to uphold the rules and protect the dignity of the palace. It was a calm, almost eerie silence that hung in the air, and the tourists began to realize just how serious this situation had become. The young man, still trying to regain his composure, took a deep breath and glanced around at his friends. They all looked as if they were in the same boat, unsure of how to move forward but unwilling to let the situation escalate any further. The woman who had suggested moving back earlier stepped forward, clearly trying to ease the tension. "Maybe we should just go," she suggested, her voice soft and uncertain. "This isn't worth it. We've had our fun, but it's clear they're not letting us get away with anything." But the young man shook his head, unwilling to completely admit defeat. "No, we're fine. They're just doing their job. Let's not overreact," he muttered. His tone was quieter now, and his earlier cockiness was no longer there. The guard who had spoken earlier was still watching them, but his gaze never wavered. He was a professional, trained to handle moments like this with quiet authority, and his presence alone was enough to make the group uneasy. It was clear that his calm demeanor was having an impact. The tourists were beginning to understand that there were consequences to their actions, and the carefree attitude they had come with was no longer appropriate. The group, realizing they weren't going to get the reaction they had hoped for, started to slowly back away. The tension, while still thick in the air, was slowly starting to ease. They were beginning to grasp that no matter how many jokes they made or how much they tried to push the boundaries, the guards would not budge. The royal guards were there to do their job, and no one, not even the loudest tourist, could intimidate them. The young man, now a little embarrassed, turned to his friends and gave a weak smile. "Let's just get some lunch. We've seen enough of the palace for today." His friends nodded, and they began to move away from the guards, though there was still an air of discomfort surrounding them. It was clear they had learned their lesson, but it wasn't over yet. They were still aware of the guards' presence, still feeling the sting of their earlier behavior. As they walked away, the guard who had been closest to them gave a subtle nod, his expression never changing. It was a small acknowledgement that the situation had been resolved, but it was clear he wasn't going to let it slip by without a reminder of the respect that was required. The tourists, now realizing the weight of their actions, couldn't help but feel a little ashamed. But there was still a sense of disbelief among them. How had they been so reckless? They hadn't expected the guards to react so strongly. In the back of their minds, they were still processing everything that had just happened. They had come to see the palace, to take in the history and the grandeur of the place. But instead, they had learned a very valuable lesson about respect, authority, and tradition. As they left the area, the young man couldn't help but glance back at the guards. He had never imagined that a simple visit to a palace could turn into such an eye-opening experience. But one thing was certain. He would never forget the way the guards had handled the situation, with calm, unwavering discipline. The lesson they had learned today would stay with them long after their vacation was over. As the group of tourists slowly made their way away from the royal guards, they couldn't help but glance back nervously. The earlier cockiness that had filled the air had completely vanished, replaced by a quiet unease. They had learned a valuable lesson, but it was one they hadn't expected. What had started as a playful attempt to get attention had quickly turned into a serious reminder of the importance of respect. The young man who had been the loudest, the one who had challenged the guard, felt particularly uneasy. He had always considered himself the life of the party, the one who made everyone laugh and got all the attention. He had prided himself on his ability to charm any crowd and get away with almost anything. But now, standing in the shadow of the royal palace, he was starting to feel a sense of humility he hadn't known before. He was quiet as he walked alongside his friends, not saying much, as if he were lost in thought. The woman who had spoken up earlier, the one who had suggested they back off, kept glancing over her shoulder. She was clearly relieved that the situation hadn't escalated further, but there was a hint of embarrassment in her eyes. She had known, deep down, that they were pushing their luck, but it hadn't felt real until the guards had stepped in. "We definitely pushed it too far," she finally said, her voice soft. "I didn't think they'd react like that, though. They were so serious." The young man nodded, his mind still replaying the way the guard had stepped forward, commanding him to move back. The calm authority with which he spoke had made him realize just how much he had misjudged the situation. The rest of the group murmured their agreement. They were still processing what had happened, unsure of how to feel about it all. For a moment, the palace grounds seemed quieter, more imposing, as they walked away. The imposing presence of the guards had shifted the entire mood of the group, and they had begun to see the place, and its history, in a different light. A few of them tried to make light of the situation, but it was clear that their laughter was forced, lacking the carefree energy it had carried earlier. One man even attempted to crack a joke. "Guess we won't be getting selfies with the guards anymore." But it fell flat, and the group lapsed into silence again. As they passed through the palace gates and into a quieter area, away from the guards' watchful eyes, the young man spoke again. "You know, I thought we were just being funny, but I guess I got carried away. It's not like we were doing anything harmful, but it was definitely disrespectful." His words were honest, and they seemed to echo in the minds of everyone in the group. It wasn't just about the photo or the jokes. It was about realizing that their behavior had crossed a line they hadn't even known existed. The royal guards weren't just statues in fancy uniforms. They were people with responsibilities, trained to protect something much bigger than any of them. "I think we all learned something today," the woman said, a little more firmly this time. "Respect goes a long way, especially in a place like this." The young man nodded. "Yeah, I get that now. It's kind of embarrassing, but I'm glad we didn't cause any real trouble." They continued walking, but their footsteps were quieter now. The bustling energy of the group had settled into something more thoughtful. As they reached the restaurant, they sat down to eat, but the conversation didn't return to the carefree chatter it had been before. Instead, they talked about the palace, the history, and the guards they had almost disrespected. As they ate, there was a sense of reflection among them. What had felt like a harmless joke had turned into a reminder of the importance of understanding the places and people they encountered. They hadn't just learned about the palace or the royal guards, they had learned something about themselves too. The lesson wasn't just about what they shouldn't do in a place like that. It was about carrying that respect with them, no matter where they went. And though the situation had been awkward and uncomfortable at the time, it was clear that the group would never forget the guards' calm authority and the important lesson they had learned that day. The rest of their trip would carry a new sense of awareness, one rooted in the understanding that respect was something earned and given in return. It had been a wake-up call, and now they were more aware of the value of it. As the group sat down to eat, their earlier awkwardness lingered in the air, but there was also a sense of calm. The situation with the royal guards had not only surprised them, but it had also given them something to think about. The young man who had been the most defiant was now quieter than usual. His usual confidence had been replaced by a new sense of humility. He kept glancing at his friends, but instead of cracking jokes, he simply listened. The woman who had first suggested they back off was also thoughtful. She had been the first to recognize the seriousness of the situation, but even she hadn't fully understood how much of an impact the guards' calm authority could have. As she sat there, her mind replayed the encounter, and she couldn't help but admire how the guards had handled everything. They had remained composed, not letting the tourists' disrespectful behavior affect them in the slightest. She turned to the young man who had been the most vocal earlier. "You know," she said quietly, "I think I understand now why they do their job the way they do. They weren't just standing there in fancy uniforms. They were trained to handle exactly what we did. People who don't know where the line is." The young man nodded, taking a moment before he responded. "Yeah. At first, I thought they were just statues, just part of the show. But now I get it. They take their job seriously, and we didn't." There was an uncomfortable truth in his words, but there was also a new sense of understanding. He wasn't trying to make excuses anymore. He was simply accepting that they had crossed a line, and now he had learned what it meant to show respect. It was clear that the guards hadn't just done their job. They had taught him a lesson in a way he would never forget. As they finished their meal, the group began to talk more about the palace and the royal guards. They had started out with a sense of entitlement, thinking they could do whatever they wanted, but now they were looking at the palace differently. It wasn't just a place to take pictures and make jokes. It was a place filled with history, a place where respect wasn't just a suggestion, it was expected. One of the tourists, a quiet man who had been observing the others, spoke up. "I was thinking," he said, "about how the guards didn't react to us at first. It's like they knew we would eventually get it. They didn't have to yell or get upset. They just stood there, and that was enough. It made us stop." The others nodded, agreeing. The calmness of the guards had been so powerful that it had stopped them in their tracks. They had expected some kind of confrontation or anger, but the guards had simply let their presence speak for them. It wasn't forceful or aggressive. It was quiet, yet it had made the biggest impact. "It's strange, isn't it?" the woman said thoughtfully. "They didn't get angry, even when we pushed them. They just stood their ground, like they knew exactly what to do. It's kind of like they were waiting for us to realize we were in the wrong." There was a certain wisdom in her words, and it seemed to resonate with the group. They realized that the guards had been more than just protectors of the palace. They were also teachers in a way, showing the tourists the importance of discipline, respect, and understanding. Their actions had been calm and composed, but it had made all the difference. The young man who had tried to challenge the guard smiled slightly, a little embarrassed, but also grateful for the lesson. "I guess we got a taste of what real discipline looks like. It wasn't about power or yelling. It was about control and patience." As the group finished their meal and prepared to leave the restaurant, they knew that the day's events would stick with them. They had come to the palace with a carefree attitude, but they were leaving with something much more valuable, a deeper understanding of respect, authority, and the importance of carrying themselves with dignity. The royal guards had not only protected the palace, but they had also shown them the true meaning of being calm in the face of provocation. The tourists knew they would remember this experience for a long time. It wasn't just about the palace or the guards. It was about how a single moment could change the way you saw the world. And in the case of these tourists, it had certainly changed how they saw respect. As the day went on, the group of tourists couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. The earlier encounter with the royal guard still lingered in their minds. The silence that had followed their retreat from the palace wasn't just the result of discomfort. It was a deeper reflection of their own behavior and how they had misjudged the situation. The young man who had started all the trouble was now walking with a more thoughtful expression. He had spent most of the afternoon in quiet contemplation, trying to make sense of how quickly things had gotten out of hand. His usual lighthearted attitude had shifted. He wasn't just embarrassed about the way he had acted. He was also a little proud. Not of what he had done, but of how the situation had turned out. He had learned something valuable, and he was beginning to see the importance of discipline in a way he had never appreciated before. As they continued their sightseeing, they couldn't help but notice the many other tourists around them. Some were loud and carefree, taking photos without a care in the world, while others seemed to be respecting the rules, staying at a distance from the guards. It became clear that not everyone understood the significance of the palace or the role of the royal guards. Some still treated the experience like just another attraction to be visited, without truly appreciating the history and the traditions that came with it. But for the group of tourists who had learned the hard way, things were different now. They had seen how a single moment could shift the mood of an entire group. They had gone from carefree laughter and mockery to quiet understanding and respect. The day's events had completely changed the way they viewed the place they were visiting. It was no longer just a tourist spot. It was a living part of history, and the guards were more than just figures standing in the background. They were protectors of that history, embodying the strength and discipline of generations past. Later that evening, as the group gathered around at dinner, the conversation turned back to the guards. There was no longer any mocking tone in their voices. Instead, there was genuine respect. The young man who had been the most vocal earlier spoke up first. "I never thought I'd say this," he said, looking around at his friends, "but I'm actually glad things turned out the way they did. I felt embarrassed, but I learned a lot from it. I'll never disrespect anyone like that again." The others nodded in agreement. There was a quiet understanding among them now that hadn't been there before. The experience with the royal guards had opened their eyes to something bigger than themselves. It was more than just about following rules. It was about understanding the people who upheld those rules and why they were so important. "We all kind of realized it, didn't we?" said the woman who had first suggested they back off. "It's not just about respect for the guards. It's about respecting the place and the history behind it. We're visitors here, and it's important to remember that." They all nodded in unison, and for the first time that day, they felt at ease with each other. The awkwardness that had once filled the air was replaced by a new sense of camaraderie and mutual understanding. They weren't the same group of tourists who had walked into the palace with no regard for the guards. They were now a group who had learned the true meaning of respect. As they finished their meal, the conversation shifted to other topics, but the impact of their experience with the guards stayed with them. They talked about their plans for the rest of the trip, but there was a noticeable change in the way they spoke. They were more thoughtful, more aware of the places they visited, and more respectful of the cultures they encountered. They had come to realize that respect wasn't just something you gave when it was convenient. It was something that needed to be earned and given at all times. It wasn't just about following rules. It was about understanding why those rules existed in the first place. And as they continued their trip, they would carry that lesson with them. By the time they finished their meal and got up to leave, the group of tourists was no longer just a group of sightseers. They had become thoughtful travelers, more aware of the impact their actions had on the places they visited. They had learned something that would stay with them far beyond their trip, something they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. As the evening wound down and the tourists prepared to leave the restaurant, they couldn't shake off the thoughts that had been running through their minds all day. The experience with the royal guards had left a lasting impact on them. something deeper than just a momentary embarrassment. It was a shift in perspective that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The young man who had been the most outspoken earlier was the first to speak up. "You know, I keep thinking about how everything went down with the guards. I've never been that embarrassed before, but at the same time, I'm kind of grateful for it. It was a wake-up call. I always thought I could get away with anything, but today showed me that's not always the case." His friends looked at him with understanding nods. They had seen the change in him throughout the day. His usual cocky attitude had softened, replaced by a more thoughtful and humble demeanor. It wasn't just the guard's sternness that had affected him. It was the realization that respect and discipline weren't just concepts. They were powerful forces that commanded attention. The woman who had spoken up earlier also added her thoughts. "I think we all learned something today. It wasn't just about the guards or the palace. It's about understanding our place as visitors and how important it is to respect the places we visit, no matter how small or grand they are." The group nodded in agreement. They had come to the palace that morning expecting nothing more than a fun sightseeing trip, but now they were leaving with a much deeper understanding of the world around them. What had seemed like an insignificant rule about respecting personal space had turned into an important lesson in humility and respect for the traditions of others. As they left the restaurant and walked through the streets, the city felt different. It wasn't just a place to snap photos and cross off their list of tourist attractions anymore. It was a city full of history, culture, and stories that deserved respect. They had spent their entire trip taking things for granted, but now they saw things through a new lens. The palace, the guards, even the people who lived in the city, everything now seemed more meaningful. They decided to take one last walk through the area. But this time, their steps were slower, more reflective. They passed by the royal palace again, and as they did, they couldn't help but glance up at the guards, still standing at their posts. But this time, their gazes weren't filled with mockery or dismissal. They felt genuine respect for the role those guards played in protecting the traditions and history of the place. The group fell into a quiet rhythm as they walked, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The experience had made them realize that respect wasn't something you could pick and choose when it was convenient. It was something you gave freely, all the time. And that meant respecting people, cultures, and traditions that were different from their own. They had learned that today, and they knew it would stay with them for years to come. As the day came to a close, they stood together in the fading light, looking at the palace one last time. The lessons they had learned on their trip were not just about the guards or the rules they had broken, but about the world itself. The trip had started with a sense of entitlement, but it was ending with a newfound sense of respect. They had come to see the importance of tradition, of authority, and of understanding that not everything was meant to be challenged or mocked. The young man who had learned the most from the experience turned to his friends and smiled. "I think we'll be seeing the world a little differently from now on." His friends agreed, and as they walked away, they knew that the lessons they had learned that day would change the way they traveled and the way they lived. They weren't just tourists anymore. They were people who had learned how to respect the places and people they encountered, and that respect would guide them on every future journey.